Okay, great. So we will start off with the first item in terms of what we're seeing. First, we'll start off with one of the major challenges. As we're now in summer 2021, we're now approaching 2 years of being impacted by COVID-19 along with other global factors. And unfortunately, it's led to closures of cultural institutions. There sadly are many examples, and from what we're seeing for us based in the Pacific Northwest, one we're seeing is with unfortunately, the closure of the Motorsports World of Speed Museum outside of Portland, Oregon in 2020. Katrina O'Brien, the head of archives and collections there, delivered a very powerful presentation at the Northwest Archivist Conference back in May titled Dissolving a Museum's Archives and Collections. And it's very valuable to be able to review that. I believe that presentation has been made available, and really it's lessons that can be applied at any stage of a cultural institution, no matter where you're at. Maintaining relationships with stakeholders, really being able to update policies and procedures, and then also, I would say, to take a step back, understanding the emotional labor required for an activity like that, especially in managing a team or being a part of a team and working together to be able to deliver on that task. And another example, and this is here locally in Seattle where I'm based, and this is cited partially as a result of the impacts of COVID-19. We witnessed the closure of the Vulcan Arts and Entertainment portfolio, and that includes the Living Computers Museum and Labs, Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum, and one of my favorite theaters, the historic Cinerama Theater, all of which included items from the collection and archives of Vulcan founder Paul Allen. We're also seeing a variety of adjacent job titles. Now, some of you may see this for those of you that are job seekers now, and so kind of compiled just a short list of some of the things that we're seeing. We're seeing titles such as project manager, information technology manager, program coordinator, digital asset manager, digital asset coordinator, content strategist, and the majority of these have some form of the word content, asset, or especially digital in there somewhere. And we introduced this just to encourage all of you that are looking for work to be mindful of that in your search. A lot of you may have already seen that. Sometimes those terms are really outside of the control of the hiring manager, or could be something that's a requirement based on the project or the grant. And so just to keep that in mind as you're looking, but it really can be a word salad sometimes in terms of those, but really the responsibilities remain the same. And then finally, we have the onset of hybridized roles. Part of that also was related to the impact of COVID-19. For instance, one thing we've seen is only essential folks that are designated as essential staff only being allowed on site. So in some cases, having facility staff being on site and doing some of the archives work, because unfortunately, some of those workers that are termed as archivists may not be allowed to be on site because of not having that essential worker designation. If we move on here, there's a very interesting example that I'd like to just briefly touch on. This is a screenshot from a Twitter post from Ellen Cushing. Ellen is the special projects editor of The Atlantic, and this is a job post that is for a archivist historian role. And this is a temporary role, and it's to support the Inheritance Project, which has an aim to, quote, be a project about American history, Black life, and the resilience of memory, with part of the purpose to center Black American writers and contributors. What I found interesting about it was actually some of the responses to this initial post. As some of you in the audience may be thinking of, is looking at an archivist and looking at a historian traditionally as being very different roles. Yet in this particular case, they're asking for competencies in both to be able to effectively deliver on the objectives of the job. So I think that's something also that we would encourage you all to be thinking about as well, is this idea that a lot of what we're seeing may be tied to specific projects or initiatives, and to be aware that part of the job seeking process may be having conversations with hiring managers, with employers, about really what that entails, and the idea that some of these descriptions may not be written in stone and may be subject to further revision based on how some of those conversations go.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent point, Ryan. With this one post, I think it resonated throughout our field and the historian field. I think because it hit on several issues that both of the fields have experienced in terms of misunderstanding fundamentally of what it is that we do as archivists or historians, as well, of course, as the problematic view of only just now prioritizing Black voices and having that viewed as a temporary role versus a permanent role, which I know we're going to get into some more in just a moment here. But yeah, this is such an excellent example because it did happen so recently, and I think taps into several of those issues that we, as both archivists and historians, need to have some tough conversations on.
Absolutely.
So Ryan found very recently another job posting for us to talk about. And Ryan, as this was your find, I want to give you the floor first. But for our audience who has joined us today, Ryan and I have agreed to do sort of like a live dissection of this job post and talking about what we're seeing here in terms of this is a trend moving forward, or this is something new, this is something we're optimistic about, or this is something we're concerned about. So, just sort of providing our observations and insight and applying it very specifically to this particular case study. So, with that, I'll have you start first, Ryan.
Thank you, Rachel. This very much is a recent posting. In fact, it was posted just today. It is a archivist role for physical assets in archives. And one thing that's interesting is, unlike some of the job postings that we've seen, this is one that has as a requirement to be on site. We've seen a number of examples, and I think there's a lot of examination around the amount of time that an archivist is required to be on site, to be able to manage a collection. And so this is one that really gets more to that traditional idea of, as it says in the title, managing the physical assets of the company. We're also seeing a heavy concentration around digital asset management as well. Those are some of the core responsibilities. Looking at the first four of the bullet points, they all speak to that in some way. What I find interesting about this is that it's kind of a blend of what would be more of a traditional kind of archivist role with achieving what seems to be some strong digital asset management that looks like it will not only support Netflix in an external customer facing way, but also internally as it relates to content strategy, potentially even taxonomy work.
Hmm. Yes, all excellent points. I think I'll start off with the digital part of this. This post is enormous to me. Enormous in terms of the title is quite literally physical assets, but as Ryan pointed out, there's a significant portion devoted to the digital assets as well in terms of what the roles would be responsible for. And then there's also this enormity in terms of it's starting a new archive program
Mm-hmm.
for a humongous organization with many, many, many assets. And it's not only setting it up, but like needing to set up the digital infrastructure of which you would put the digital assets into. One of these is also saying, I believe you're able to hire and train a team to come in and help, which
Mm-hmm.
I was glad to see in terms of like, this is more than a one person job. But what I noticed was that it didn't actually call out that this role would be a managerial role. And
Mm,
so one of
yes.
my concerns as someone who has established several archival programs is not only like the sheer scope of this, but also the complete lack of acknowledgement of like, yes, we want you to get and train people, but no, we're not going to actually acknowledge that in terms of you being a manager, which is usually a way companies use as a strategy to not pay you appropriately in terms of what your actual responsibilities are. So that's something that I'm concerned about that I see here, that I would recommend to whoever may be applying or interviewing that that is something that you ask them about. I think some of the other things, Ryan, and I'd love to get your take on the qualifications part. I was happy to see, knowing that this is going to be like a complete setup job for the physical and the digital stuff, that they're asking for at least 7 years of experience in archival management. Um, what I'm interested in is that they're not referencing like the digital certification that
Mhm.
SAA offers. There's other than sort of name dropping MLS as maybe a particular degree, I didn't see sort of anything else that indicated that they were looking for any specific technical qualifications. What's your read on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And thank you for your analysis as well. Excellent point regarding centering and recognizing the importance of the management role. And really, it's tied to this whole program being successful. And, in my mind, I think that would be something very significant to have explicitly stated here. To get to the next point, I did see this idea of, a strong understanding of digital asset management systems, both front and back end, and the willingness to learn a new one and another one.
Hmm.
Is there existing digital asset management system? Is there going to be a migration from one that's being deprecated? And if that's the case, it'd be great then to kind of see some further expectations from on a technical level of what they're looking for there.
Right.
And going in and if one had the opportunity to interview, highly encourage being able to have some of those things be discussed. And then one thing that's kind of in the back of my mind too, getting back to the managerial point, is are those roles going to be outsourced with another consultancy? And because that would then impact how the management process would work. It could even impact the access to the material. So all of those things coming into play. You raised the case well there, Rachel, about wondering more about some of the competencies as it relates to digital asset management, and in particular where the title says physical assets. It just makes me wonder how those two are weighted in the organization, and any opportunity to have a follow up conversation, kind of understanding how that balance plays out.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. Another thing that I wonder that your point had reminded me of is this qualification down here: a strong understanding of digital asset management systems, which great, both front and back end. And then in parentheses, a very odd note, and a willingness to learn a new one and another new one. And so for me, it's like, do you have systems already? And if you do, name them, because that
Mm-hmm.
would be tremendously more informative for the people who are applying in terms of like, oh yes, I do have experience using that system, or no, but I am familiar and can learn, kind of thing. Or is this a note that sort of indicates a thought process, which I see a lot as a consultant working with clients who aren't as familiar with digital management systems and collections management systems, where they're, instead of having a strategy to have one system to help do all of your things, there's an approach where you get multiple systems that do just one thing very well, which I find the latter approach, while laudable in terms of wanting the right tools for the job, if you are just one person, which so far you would be if you get this job until you hire a team, and you're implementing multiple systems, that's a red flag for me in terms of like capacity, also what is the budget, and like how are you going to make them all talk to each other? Like those are all questions I have. Which with Netflix, I would hope that they would actually give whoever is setting up this archives a very healthy budget. But
Mm-hmm.
that was just something that stuck out with like, what are you trying to say here?
Excellent point, Rachel.
Well, any other thoughts, Ryan, before we wrap up our dissection of this particular post?
I would just say, in summary, and certainly, I think this is something for us to celebrate. Being
Yeah.
able to have such a high visibility role, be able to consider what might be a domino effect of this as well for other similar companies to be thinking, well, hey, maybe we need that too, because Netflix is this recognized industry leader. So, being able to all share in this to celebrate the fact that this is a position that perhaps could lead to other opportunities for us in the field.
Absolutely. Yeah. As you said, Ryan, this is This is a good post for, even though I had things to offer commentary on, this is one of the better posts I have seen
Hmm.
coming from a company that doesn't have an archives background or integration. So yes, this is great. They're using the right language, even though there's a couple things we have questions on. It is clear that they either have someone or talk to somebody to knowledgeably put this post together. I think my only other recommendation for Netflix, not that they're watching this webinar, but for all of you as well, for if and when you do put job posts out, do please put the salary on there, especially for a job like this where it is going to be a managerial role. You are setting up an archives program and you're based in Los Angeles, California. Like, those are all things that require a lot of experience and education, and you want a skilled person. And if you want those people to consider and apply for your job, they're going to need to see what the salary is to see if it's a good fit. And for those of you who do want to apply to this job, which, like, I don't blame you, it would be awesome to get, do look up the cost of living for Los Angeles, California, compare that to the living wage, and compare that to other jobs in and around the area in terms of what sort of the median salary range is, so that you can go in knowledgeably when you have that salary conversation with Netflix or whomever you're interviewing with. I do have a webinar that I'll link to that helps lead you through the calculating your worth. But yes, for those posting jobs, put the salary on there. And for those applying for jobs, don't be afraid to ask for it because nobody wants to waste their time if it's a bad match. So that's end of preach. Well, thank you for indulging me in that live dissection, Ryan. I really appreciate you giving your thoughts and being so thoughtful about it.
Anytime, Rachel.
All right. Well, to move us along, we are going to continue getting into some of the changes and what we're seeing. As we know, the global economy, the global workforce, and the increase due to COVID of remote work. I mean, we were already starting to operate at a global capacity pre-pandemic in terms of things that would happen in other countries, current events, catastrophes, etc., would have an impact on our economy and vice versa. Also, with the tools and technology that we have available, being able to work more easily and globally is something that we were already seeing in application. Maybe not as much in the archives field, but certainly for any job sector, being able to do employ a global workforce was becoming a more common idea. And then, of course, with the global pandemic, we have seen the forced embrace of remote work. And for those who can work from home in these last 18 months, that has, I think, shown to a lot of people that it is not only possible, but in many cases preferred. Preferred for productivity on the business strategy solution side, and also preferred for people who have lives that they're trying to live that have been impacted by the pandemic. So, for many reasons, remote work has become not only a requirement for the situation, but also something that I think is going to be with us moving forward. And I think there's a strong business case for that, as well as a human case for that. I mean, we are all people with families and people that we care about, with situations that extend far beyond work that we need to deal with and in order to live our lives. So we were already seeing that, and then we saw like a dramatic increase. Now, for my next bullet point, with that in mind, we are starting to see a huge increase in what is being termed by a lot of the business sector as the Great Resignation. And this is essentially a phrase that is being used to describe this sort of mass exodus of workforce from companies who are choosing not to continue remote or flexible work options, and the sort of shared consensus almost in terms of after the last 18 months that we just endured, and knowing that we're not out of it yet in terms of the pandemic, at least. The in seeing companies and organizations that just like really aren't acknowledging the trauma that has happened, the human costs that we're still paying right now with the pandemic, that sort of bad decision making and tone deafness on those companies and organizations part has been enough to lead many people to quit their jobs. So it has been happening these last few months, and I think we're going to continue to see this increase in people leaving the workforce, especially since because we're in a global economy, like people can work anywhere now thanks to technology. So there are tons of job options for these people leaving their jobs. It's going to be fascinating to see, and especially as it pertains to the archives as a field, I am very curious how we'll see that great resignation impact us or not, given the sort of the hybridness of our roles typically with working with physical collections, but also so much of what we do now is digital. And then the last thing I want to talk about, it sort of related to thinking about the workforce, but individually as us as humans, we are starting to see the increase in demand for transparency from companies and organizations, and specifically transparency around compensation and benefits. So, we talked about the Netflix posting and how it didn't have any mention of salary or benefits, and how that makes it increasingly difficult for those who are looking for a job to spend any amount of time putting a thoughtful application together because they don't actually know if the salary is actually going to work for them and their family and their situation. So I think we're starting to, in general, just see this fed upness of traditional practices in all of the fields in terms of not being transparent on compensation and how we're just not taking it anymore. And so we're starting to increasingly see in the museum and archives field statements coming out from professional organizations saying if they are not requiring, they're at least strongly recommending that salary ranges or salary statement be posted. And so I think, Ryan, that we're going to continue seeing that as we move forward, especially with things like the Great Resignation happening. I think that's just more fuel to the fire. I would love to hear your thoughts, though, if you have any before I move on.
Absolutely. I think to that last point, Rachel, one thing in collections work is really the history and legacy of the hidden labor involved in it. So I think part of this demand comes from trying to surface the value of that work and to be more transparent about it. I've been really encouraged by colleagues, and it's something that I've explored as well, is trying to make more of that work visible by being in the paradigm of remote work. And so, what I mean by that is, I've seen some really great examples of being able to do a virtual archives tour, being able to do segments to do a quick minute or two on some highlights of the collection that can approach outreach again, show show the value of what we're doing kind of in a way that hadn't been thought about before, or perhaps was maybe a secondary consideration. So I think, again, to that point, been kind of a bedrock of circumstances that have kind of created that, in addition to just the very strong equity element that also is very important in this consideration and that you touched on, Rachel.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you for adding that. Moving us along, we're going to get into the next section now titled Where We Are Headed. And so this is Ryan and I taking what we've observed and what we're seeing as consultants in the industry and doing some forecasting in terms of where we might be headed. So I believe I will start us off with this one. Some of these points are major pain points, and so I do want to make sure that we address these. What we have been seeing thus far, and where I think we may be headed, is an increased absorption of traditional collections work, excuse me, into broader roles. And so I know that's something that Ryan touched on, especially as we talked about the Atlantic example and some of the job posts that we're starting to see now. And especially with COVID, with funding being so precarious, and then even more so after, with the pandemic, there is this broader amalgamation of, okay, so collections are collections. So if we have a museum with an archives, then the curator can just manage both of them. Like they're both collections. Somebody at the administrative level has made that decision for better or worse, that maybe they could just have that hybrid role. Um, that is obviously concerning for us who are specialized professionals who understand that there's a difference between a curator and an archivist and a registrar and a digital asset manager and what have you. But with organizations having awful budgets and not being financially sound, we are, I think, unfortunately going to continue seeing the absorption of that type of work. And so that is something that I want you and all of us to be aware of as we're looking at the field and seeing that happen. I don't have a solution for it yet, but I think the first step is to make sure that we know it's happening and that it is a problem, and maybe it's something we can start working on for a solution. Another trend that I am seeing that will continue and perhaps get worse is an increase in project based temporary position and grant funded work. This, with our field not being robust financially, like that has never been the case. There has always been the existence of grant funded projects or temporarily funded positions as and when a little bit of a financial bucket may be made available to the archives. But unfortunately, this has only increased in terms of analyzing the jobs that have been available over these last few years compared to even 10 years ago. The majority of them these last few years have only been temporary or project based versus a permanent full time position. And that's concerning because it's not healthy for those organizations to continually go through temporary positions and then losing people and then maybe not having somebody and then another temporary position. Like that's not good for consistent collections care and management. But it's also incredibly economically exploitive to the workforce and the people in our field to expect them to string together a variety of temporary project-based work. It's not sustainable for them. They can't buy a house or have a family on that kind of salary. And typically, when they are temporary or project based, there isn't the additional compensation of like healthcare benefits or a retirement plan or daycare for children kind of thing. So if they're lacking some basic benefits as well as not getting great pay because it's temporary and project based, it's not good. It's not a good human decision and it's not a good organizational decision. And so this is another thing I want us to be incredibly aware of. I think some of the emerging solutions, one of which is being transparent with salaries. Another is to make sure that we hold accountable not just the organizations, but the granting agencies that are giving these awards, because in essence, if they are funding a position that is not substantial enough to actually be the value of that work, then we're basically allowing them to dictate what that value is, and it's not enough. So I think we need to do some more advocacy work there. And then the last thing that I want to talk about on this particular subject is we're starting to see work tied to initiatives rather than specific collections. And what I mean by that is, especially in these last few years, as we start to, or at least recommit to doing hard work in terms of making sure that our collections are truly representative and making sure that we're elevating voices that haven't typically been invited to the historical record or the table. We are seeing initiatives to address this, and I think that is great in terms of addressing. Where I am concerned, though, is that initiatives such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, when I see those types of projects and I see initiative attached to it, to me, that communicates a temporary sense that this is something temporary to focus on. Whereas I would argue the recommitment to being accurate with the historical record and inviting more people to the table to tell their story, that is a lifestyle change being more diverse and inclusive is a lifestyle change, is not a trend. It is not something we're doing just for now as an initiative. So I would like all of us to think about that as we move forward and how we're talking about performing that work and what is or is not a temporary job versus a permanent programmatic change. I know that was quite a lot, Ryan, but do you have anything you'd like to add to that before we continue?
I think all of that was very important matters to think about. I'll just add a few quick elements as well. One of the things that, as we were preparing for this webinar, that we looked at was what are some kind of foundations to understand the employment sector overall. And so one of the things we researched into was the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have a category for archivists, curators, and museum workers. And granted, this was a projection done in 2019, but one thing that was a bit surprising was a prediction of an increase, an 11% growth rate from 2019 to 2029 for our sector, whereas the average growth rate across all sectors is 4%. So that's something like 37,500 jobs that would be well over 40,000 in the next 8 years. And so the reason I bring this up is this was, of course, before the impacts of COVID-19. But on the other hand, I think it also dovetails with what Rachel's talking about, where how much of that work is sustainable. The last statistic that really raised eyebrows for me was that for 2019 numbers, they were saying the average salary was $52,140 per year, which comes out to about $25 an hour. And as Rachel talked about earlier, how does that compare to living in Los Angeles now? In New York City, increasingly in cities that are becoming more expensive as well. And that typically is where the job centers are, drawing that magnet of us to be able to have those positions. That's one piece. And then the last piece being, what does it mean for these temporary roles in a profession that is about legacy, in a profession that is about long-term thinking? The collections that we've inherited have been maintained in our mind for a long time, but really the mission, really the drive of what we do is that collections care, is that management into perpetuity as we understand it. So to have these roles be defined as temporary, how do we find consistency in that to be able to ultimately achieve what it is that we're charged to do?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the other points that Ryan, you and I had discussed previously were, touching on that grant funded aspect. And especially when you have a grant funded diversity and inclusion initiative, we've been seeing, especially over this last year, major granting agencies start a new set aside of funding for community archives. And we're seeing it done in a variety of different ways. Ryan, I know you mentioned Mellon is one of the major ones, most recently funding community archives. And I do love that they put the emphasis on the community themselves being the ones that apply and receive and can administer that money. I love that it gives them the agency to lead that, rather than somebody from the outside having to forcing to come in or however that may happen. I know we've seen it the other way too, in terms of organizations are all of the sudden charged with all of a sudden doing a community initiative, and it is questionable in terms of execution. But when we're looking at those granting opportunities, one of the other ones that has come up, Library of Congress just did a temporary funding call for community archives. But when you apply for federal funding, as some of you may be aware, you have to go through grants.gov, which also means that you have to go through the certification for that. And it's intense. And if you don't already have an account, then you're already behind by several weeks. And it's such an intensive application process that if you're setting aside money for a community that hasn't had the ability to access this money before, who probably doesn't have the accounts in place or the staff who know how to put the accounts in place to even apply for these grants, it really does concern me in terms of, we're making this money available, but it is only in a temporary fashion, and it is only through the traditional granting mechanisms that already put up so many barriers. Like there's already an equity deficit here in terms of who can apply for those, who has the capacity and knowledge to apply for those. So I know that's getting us a bit off topic, but was there anything that I missed, Ryan, or that you wanted to share on that point?
Well, I think you expressed it quite well. It's laudable to the attention and the focus and the centering of projects that are extremely important, looking at what the Mellon Foundation is stating for the community-based archives program. To touch on what you mentioned a moment ago, really the heart of it is looking at, and this is drawing from the call for proposals, activation and advocacy efforts, including resident community activist archivist positions, ethical preservation of social media, and increased community use of archives. So again, all of these goals are great, but I think speaking to the point that you raised, Rachel, how can that really be made central to the organization? How can we be at a point where it's not always dependent on trying to get the resources to align with the other institutional program? So that sense of going from an initiative to a program, meaning that it's regular, there's an expectation of resources along with an overall larger strategic plan to be able to support that for the future.
Yes. Yep. Well said.